Hello and welcome to our first video notes of the unit, but our second day of the unit, where we're going to discuss sampling bias. So we sort of hinted at these things in the little activity, trying to think about like what are some ways that it could maybe go wrong when you're trying to collect data from a sample. So let's take this context. Suppose that we're talking about Fremont High School. We wanted to investigate what do our students, all the students, sort of think about adding more gender-neutral bathrooms to the campus. In order to collect data from every single student, that could be difficult and time consuming. So what we often do is we take a sample and we want to do it the right way, in a way that gives us a representative sample. In other words, the sample's sort of demographics sort of mirror the population pretty closely. So let's suppose we do a quote unquote good job of taking a sample from our population. And what is a good job? We'll talk about sort of different ways that are good to sample next notes. But are we guaranteed to get a sample that perfectly reflects our population? No, absolutely not. In fact, due to sampling variability, we know that depending upon the sort of different samples we take, there's going to be this natural tendency that these different samples we were to draw from the population would be different from one another, and none of them would likely perfectly reflect the population. So that's normal. That's okay. That's totally fine, is this sampling variability if we're doing things the right way. What is a problem is something called sampling bias. And this is a systematic failure of sampling method in order to properly represent the population, okay? Something that's really important to note is that if you've collected a sample and it has biases already in it, you can't fix that after the fact. So our goal would be to plan ahead. How do we in advance kind of come up with methods that would help us avoid these things? And really the only way you can think about how to avoid these things is if you know what things you're supposed to be avoiding. So we're going to go through all these different biases here. So let's talk about the first one here. Voluntary response bias. So this is when subjects must, as it sort of explains in the name, volunteer or take some prior action to be included in a sample. So I want you to pause the video for a moment and think about how could this maybe create bias? And can you think of some examples of where like we might see a voluntary response bias occur? All right, so in general, with these sorts of things, what we find out is people with really strong opinions are more likely to respond to these. We also can see that maybe if they have like high passion or interest in the topic, they're going to be more likely to respond. Okay. Which makes our sample not representative anymore, because we would not believe that all of Fremont's students have some high passion or strong opinion about gender-neutral bathrooms. There might be people that are more apathetic. And so that's where sort of the bias starts to come in, is that you might not hear from the people that are more apathetic. So some examples. An email with a link to an online survey that's optional for students to complete outside of class, outside of school. And so this is a problem because if we send an email, there are students who don't check their emails, so we'll not hear from them. Or maybe they do check their emails and they look at it and they're like, oh, I don't have time for that. I have, an APUSH, exam coming up soon. So they would just delete the email. Or have a session during lunch in the student center for our students to raise any opinions or questions. And at the end of that meeting, there's a survey. Again, we're sort of putting a barrier in between coming. You have to come to this lunch. You have to give up your lunch in order to come here. And so what will probably happen is, again, you're just going to get people that have really strong opinions about this, and not people maybe who, have less strong opinions about it, maybe are a little more apathetic. So that's the first bias there, voluntary response bias. You can see that this is something that we do a lot. Like there's a lot of different surveys that kind of get thrown out there for people to sort of fill out. And this is a thing that is huge. So like a lot of these surveys that maybe we get from our school, our district, have this in there, is that it's all voluntary. There's nothing required about it. Next one, convenience sampling bias. This is a pretty common one, but I think one that a lot of people sort of immediately recognize, like, oh, this is not helpful at all. So this is when subjects are chosen. Oh, whoa, what just happened to me on there? Are chosen because they are convenient. So they're conveniently available due to some factor here. So think about why that would create a bias, and can you think of some examples that might go along with that? So how does this create bias? So sometimes when people are convenient to access, they kind of have the same opinions as each other. And so some examples of this, like a student asks all their friends. Well, there's probably a good reason they're hanging out with each other. They probably have similar views on things. And so if you ask all of your friends about it, if you're maybe really passionate about it, there's probably a chance that you're passionate about it. Or a student asks all the students coming out of the boys' library bathroom. Oh, it says next to the library. So boys' bathroom next to the library. If they're using the facilities, then maybe they're actually okay with the current situation here. So like, you might actually want to be talking to people who are kind of like afraid to go to the bathroom. And the fact that they're, boys' bathroom might mean that they're dealing with people that identify as male and aren't really concerned with the fact that there aren't gender neutral bathrooms at all. So it kind of seems like an interesting idea at first, right? Like, ooh, like, hey, we're asking about bathrooms. What if I hang out by the bathroom? A little creepy, but also like it does sort of have these biases in there that we need to sort of watch out for. All right, moving on to the next bunch here, undercoverage bias. Undercoverage bias is when some portion of the population is not sampled at all or has a, reduced chance. That's what I wanted to write on that line. Reduced chance of being included in the sample. Okay, so think about, why would that create a bias? I think that's pretty obvious, but can you think of some examples where that would happen? So why would this create bias? Well, obviously this prevents the sample from reflecting the population proportions. And clearly makes it not representative. If our goal is really to create a sample that like perfectly represents the population, knowing that that's pretty unachievable, we really hurt ourselves here if we end up taking a sample where a particular proportion of our population, a subset of our population is way overrepresented or way underrepresented. That would be a problem here. So like, for example, something that sounds like a good idea probably at the start here is like ask all the ASB students. They're involved in the school. They have passions about the school. They want the school to be as good as possible. But then there's a little bit of a problem here. You're dealing with just ASB students. So this excludes all the non-ASB students on the campus. Maybe their opinions are different from ASB students. Or, this is a really good one here, ask all transgender non-binary students to voice their opinions. Again, at first this seems like a great idea because you start thinking like, well, who uses the gender neutral bathrooms? Like who really benefits from this? And it's like, oh, our transgender, our non-binary community. So like, let's get their opinions because their opinions matter. And it's true, their opinions do matter. But that overrepresents that particular population. And so you're not getting the voices of some of our cisgendered students at all. And that is not reflective of the population. So it seemed like a really good idea, but it's actually a bias that is included in your survey. All right, let's move on to the next one, non-response bias. Non-response bias. So this is when a substantial fraction of those properly sampled, so like this is sort of including like, hey, I think we did things pretty well here, but a substantial fraction of this properly sampled failed to respond. So think about why that would cause an issue, and can you think of any examples? So why does this create a bias? Well, if many of the subjects don't respond, even if the response rates are proportional to the major identified subject. So even if you're like, I sent out, this survey, I only got, a handful of responses, but you break it down and you're like, well, when I look at the demographics here, it actually turns out like it kind of worked out nicely. I got the same amount of, this type of student versus this type of student proportionally to the whole population. It's still a problem here. And so the key here is that we didn't really do anything wrong in how we sort of attempted to conduct the sampling. We just had a lot of people who didn't respond to us. So for example, if we send an email to 100 randomly selected students, which is a good idea, randomness is important there, but we only get 4 responses, that'd be a problem because we're dealing with 4 people's opinions, when we were hoping to hear from 100 people's opinions. So that's a really drastic case, Sometimes it's not that bad, but sometimes it is that bad. And so that's something you have to sort of worry about there. So like the follow-up here would be actually to probably try to follow up with the other 96 people, maybe try to sit them down and force them to work through it. The follow-up is not, oh, maybe I'll just sample another 100 and maybe I'll get some more, because that's still going to end up with some non-response. And then the last one is response bias, which sounds like it's like the opposite of non-response bias, but it's not. It's a completely different thing. So, and response bias is when there's anything in the survey design that would influence the responses, such as the wording in a survey. So in a way that might be leaning towards a particular response, or perhaps there's some sort of like perceived pressure in the wording of the question or the way that it's presented to you, this survey, that could also do it. So think about why would this create bias, and what are some examples you can think of? So how would this create bias? Okay, well, so people can be actually pretty easily swayed, as it turns out. Human beings are a very easily manipulated creature. So sometimes it's just strong wording that can sway them. Sometimes the wording is confusing for them, and maybe there's not a chance to ask for clarification. Or perhaps they're afraid to be honest in their response, either like they're doing so very consciously, like I'm not going to write down the real answer here, because like my teacher, my name's on this, is asking like, have I ever consumed an alcoholic drink? Like, yeah, I'm not telling that for real. Or sometimes it happens subconsciously. Sometimes, like you ask students like, hey, like how much do you study? And in your head, you're like, probably only an hour, but maybe it's 2 hours. And then you're kind of like, oh, I'll round up 3 hours. And you feel like maybe that's right, but the answer is actually much lower than 3 hours per day or something like that. So that's sort of how that happens here. And so we're going to look at there's a lot of different ways that this is like probably the most common sort of silly way. We can really come up with really silly examples, even though sometimes these really silly examples do actually exist in the real world. So for example, question wording. A lack of gender-neutral bathrooms at Fremont is a major civil... Sorry. Got to remember what I wanted to write on this blank. Oh, a major infringement on basic human rights. Do you think Fremont should install more gender-neutral bathrooms? Okay, so the way that that's questioned there has very strong wording there. So a question, sorry, question, oh, with, this is partiality. How do I spell partiality? Sorry, I made these like a week ago. I should have recorded the video then. So a question with partiality, even if it isn't as blatant as this one, like this one is, like I feel like most people would realize like this is not how you want to word the question, but it can still make people sort of feel persuaded to try to answer a particular way. So I would like, who's asking? That's always important. Like, is it a friend or a teacher or another respected adult in your life, a parent, So, if it's these people sort of asking, then students trying to conform with what the surveyor might be wanting to hear may answer in opposition to what their true opinion is. That's a big thing there. So, if you are someone who feels differently than your friends and your friend is asking, you might be like, oh, well, I guess I probably should respond the way they want me to because they think I believe it in this way. The last thing is like students may have to submit with their name on it. That's something I was sort of mentioning earlier there. So like having an anonymous voice in some of these surveys can be really helpful. It also can backfire a little bit, but like if your name's attached to it, then you feel like you might need to respond in a different way because students might feel like they're being pressured by, again, maybe this is a friend asking you and thus your name's on it and they'll know how you feel about it, or a teacher or a parent, admin, something like that. And so having your name attached to it might make you feel like you can't respond honestly. There's also a total backfire, and we've seen this with the internet and anonymous polls that happen all the time, which is like, sometimes having anonymity can actually result in people being a little careless with sort of their opinions and sort of they just start, voting in the wrong ways. We've seen it, Bodie McBoatface in The Flash enters the Speed Force, these weird online polls that happen where, a little bit of carelessness goes into just sort of voicing their opinion. So it's a little double-edged sword. All right, so when we come into class, we're going to talk a little bit about how these aren't all just discrete ideas. You might notice that there's some overlap. So what I want you to sort of start thinking about when you turn off this video is, can you think of some of these examples here where, I said, oh, it's in, under coverage bias, but you could look at it and go like, that might also be this other bias that's going on there because of such and such. So that's what I want you to do when you turn this off is look back through each of the examples and see, does this example actually fit more than one bias? Because that's what we're going to talk about when we enter class.